Welcome again, folks, another RF900 video. Today I'm doing valves adjustment. So I highly encourage you to watch my previous video relating to this subject, which was valve clearance check. You can find this video in the description box here, or just rummage through my channel. In that video I showed how to remove every single component required to be removed to do the valve clearance check. So this is going to be removing the fuel tank, airbox, carburetors, ignition coils, valve cover, right hand side fairing, and the signal generators cover as well. Once you have everything exposed, you'd want to block those cylinder head inlets here with some rag or whatever, just to make sure nothing drops in there. And now I'm going to perform once again the valve clearance check, and then I'm going to do the adjustment procedure too. Right, so for the RF900, service manual specifies what would be the safe range for the valve clearance for intake and exhaust. So for the intake, this would be from 0.04 of an inch up to 0.08 of an inch, and for the exhaust that would be from 0.08 up to 0.12 of an inch. So why would you have two values on those feeler gauges? The top value, like this one, 8,000 for instance, this is fractions of an inch, and the bottom value, it says mm here, that's fractions of millimeter. So you can do it whatever way you want. If you feel more comfortable with inches, go with inches. If you feel more comfortable with millimeters, go with millimeters. Okay, so first step, you've got to bring your T mark. You see there's a little letter T just here with a little line pointing towards this pickup coil. This is the position that you want. So by using 19mm spanner, you grab this signal generator and you basically turn it clockwise to get desired position, and that's what you want. T mark pointing towards this pickup coil. And then you've got to make sure that the camshafts are also set up in the correct position. So let me show you what this should be. Alright, so going towards the right hand side of the motorcycle, you will see intake camshaft here, exhaust camshaft there, and what you want is you want the lobes to be pointing towards each other. So you see this intake lobe is pointing towards the front of the motorcycle, and this exhaust lobe here is pointing towards the rear of the motorcycle. So they're pointing towards each other. And just to make sure your camshafts are 100% correctly positioned, on their sides there's going to be timing marks, and they should be positioned like this. Okay, just about to start the measurements, but before we do it, we've got to have this chart ready, and that will correspond with the situation in the engine. So as you can see, we've got 4 cylinders, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So this is cylinder number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, this is number 4. Okay, and then we've got our exhaust side here, which obviously in the engine is just here. That's our exhaust side, and our intake side. Okay, so with this position of camshafts and crankshaft, and with the T mark pointing towards the top, we're going to be measuring what's circled red, which is exhaust valves on cylinder 1 and 2. So this is going to be 1 and 2, and intake valves on cylinders 1 and 3. So this is going to be 1 and 3. Okay, so I'm going to start with the exhaust side, cylinder number 1, and the specification for those valves is at least 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.200 of a millimeter. So let's put it in. It goes in very easily. And the reason why we start from the bottom is because we want to make sure the valves aren't too tight. When your valves are loose, that's not ideal, but it's not going to harm the engine. When your valves are too tight, it's bad news. So we always want to check that the valves aren't too tight. So we know this valve is definitely not too tight. So we can now go ahead with 10 thou, which is 0.254 of millimeter. And that fits easily too. Okay, So I'm gonna go straight over to 13 thou, just to make sure they're not too loose, because the maximum specification for those exhaust valves are 12 thou. So let's have a look if the 13 goes in, and it does not. Let's see if the 12 thou goes in, which is the maximum specification. See? And 12 thou goes in with a drag, so I actually have to force it a bit, but not too much. So we can then say that those two valves on cylinder number 1 on the exhaust side are 12 thou. Okay, so we've just measured cylinder number 1 exhaust side, and what we've got was 12 thou of an inch on both valves. I'm going to record the inch values at the top here, and I'm going to record the millimeter values here at the bottom. So that was 0.305, 0.305. Alright, so we've measured the cylinder 1 on the exhaust side. Now we're measuring cylinder number 1 on the intake side. And the difference here is that you're going to be measuring, putting the feeler gauges from that side. Okay, so the bottom specification for the intake valve is 4 thousandths of an inch. So let's check that. It goes in very easily. Same on the other one. So we know that the valve isn't too tight. So I'm now going to jump straight onto 7 thou, which is 0.178 of a millimeter. Let's see if that fits. That fits for the first one. And that fits for the other one as well. The top range for the intake valve, which is 8 thou of an inch, which is 0.203 millimeter. Let's see if that goes in. It does. Okay, right, so let's check the 9 thou, which is 0.229 of millimeter. And that goes in with a drag. Okay, let's just make sure that 10 thou doesn't go in. Okay, so 10 thou, which is way over the specification, and that doesn't go in both. Alright, so we've just measured cylinder number 1 on the intake side, and the left valve was 8 thou of an inch, so 0.008, which is 0.203 of a millimeter, and the right valve was 0.9 thou of an inch, which is 0.229 of a millimeter. Okay then, so 8 valves have been measured. This is for the first position of crankshaft and camshafts. And what we can see here is that on this exhaust cylinder, on the exhaust side on cylinder 1, those two valves are at the top of the specification. So actually 12 thousandths of an inch is the max what the service manual recommends. So I think I could actually reduce those two to maybe 10 or 11. So this is something to consider. Those two are okay. 10 thou, brilliant for me. 11 thou, I'm not going to bother with that either. When it comes to the intake side, we can tell that both of those are actually up for adjustment. 8 thou is maximum of the specification for intake valves, and this one is actually over. So this one is definitely going to be adjusted. Probably that one too, just to bring it down to maybe 7 thou. And on cylinder number 3 intake, we've got 7 thou on the right valve, which is ideal considering 8 thou is a max. And 5 thou, of course, isn't bad, but ideally I would want this to be at least 6 or even 7 thou of an inch, for the simple reason of I like to keep my valves somewhat on the looser side rather than on a tighter side. So to measure the clearance on the 8 remaining valves, this rotor has to be turned 360 degrees clockwise. So once again, we've got a T mark pointing towards the pickup coil. Let's do that now. Okay, so it's in the same position but turned 360 degrees. And have a look at the camshafts now. Right, because we've turned the crankshaft 360 degrees, the lobes on the right hand side of the engine pointing away from each other. Now with this position of crankshaft and cams, we're going to be measuring clearances on the remaining cylinders, which is cylinder number 3 and 4 on the exhaust, and cylinder number 2 and 4 on the intake. Okay, so I'm going to start with the intake side on cylinder number 2, and we're going to go with the bottom of the range, which is, hopefully you can see this, 4/1000 inch, which is 0.102 of a millimeter. So on the intake side, we attack the valves from this position. Goes in really easily for that valve. Goes in really easily for the other valve too. Okay, so 5/1000, which is 0.127 of a millimeter. Goes fairly easily on that side and on the other one as well. Okay, there we go. We're going to 6/1000. Still goes in. Oh, actually it will be very hard. Let's just check 7/1000 on the left valve. No, it wouldn't go in. So we can call it 6/1000 on both valves. Okay then, so I've measured all the valves and I think I'm going to go with adjusting 4 of those. It's the valves with little red cross inside them. So I'm going to adjust those two, and then on the intake side I've only got 2 valves, which is the right valve on the cylinder number 1 on the intake, which was 9/1000, just a bit too loose, so I'm going to get this down to 7, maybe 8. And then weirdly, left valve on cylinder number 3 intake side is, I wouldn't say it's extremely tight, but you know, 5/1000. I would want it to be 6/1000 to be perfect. To make valve adjustments, unfortunately you have to remove a lot of components. So we're going to start with removing of the cam holders. Then you're going to have to remove the cam chain tensioner, which is just there. And then you're going to have to remove the camshafts, and on top of that you're going to have to remove the tappets to get access to your little shims. First, let's just bring the T mark to the top again, and the camshafts have to be in the starting position, which was both lobes pointing towards each other. So this is the intake lobe pointing towards the front of the motorcycle, and exhaust lobe pointing towards the rear of the motorcycle. Little tip, you've got to have your inlets covered with something just to make sure nothing drops inside the engine. And as you can see, I've got a little rag there just below the cam sprockets, and that's because there's a big hole which exposes the crankshaft. So what might happen is you might accidentally drop a tool or a bolt or a socket inside there, and then it's a game over. So I've got a little rag over there just to make sure nothing drops in there. Just half a turn to make it released. Just half a turn. Again. The thing is, you want to release that stress from the head really evenly.
A few moments later.
So first I'm going to remove those oil pipes. Now I'm going to be removing the cam holders. So just a bit of a wiggle action gets them out. Okay, and that one. All right. Okay. And the next one comes out. Excellent. And you see, this is what I was talking about. Look how close it was to drop this dowel pin somewhere in the engine. So you've got to be really, really careful and pay attention to what you're doing. Of course, it's very much recommended that you keep them exactly the same way as they came out. So you see, this is your cam holder A. This is your cam holder B. Then you've got C here and D here with oil pipes exactly same way as they came out. Go by hand now. There we go. A little pop and the tensioner comes out. Okay, so we can now finally remove the camshafts. So I'm going to start with the exhaust side. I'm going to lift this chain here, get it off the sprocket and delicately rotate the cam and get it out. I'm going to do the same with the other cam. Excellent. And just not to drop this chain, I'm going to attach it to that hook here. Right, so just about to remove the tappets so we get access to the shims. So as you can see, you've got your tappets here. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 8 tappets on the exhaust side as well. So just looking at the diagram, we're going to be removing tappets to expose intake cylinder number 1 for the right hand side valve and intake cylinder 3 for the left hand side valve. So to do that, you're going to have to use a magnet. I've got this really cool magnet with a little light at the end of it. So this is the tappet that we're exposing. It simply lifts up, and be careful because there's a shim just underneath it, so you don't want to drop it anywhere. So be very, very gentle and slow. And here we have it. There's your little shim underneath it. So let's now remove that little shim. Now that's what it looks like inside with the shim removed. And as you can see, on one side you've got that little circle, but on the other side you actually have a value stamped. Now in many cases those values will be wiped out. Unfortunately you won't be able to see them because obviously constant tapping of the valve on that tappet will cause friction and that number will disappear, but in this case we can actually see that it's 165. Okay, so here we have our shim on that valve that was slightly on the loose side. As you can see, the measurement was 9,000th of an inch, which is equal to 0.229 of a millimeter. Now to reduce that clearance between the tappet and the cam lobe, so imagine, you know, my finger is a cam lobe. To reduce that clearance between them, we would have to put in a thicker shim. Thicker shim under this bucket would cause the bucket to go up, meaning the clearance between the two gets smaller. Now, if you had not enough clearance and you wanted to increase the clearance, obviously you will be putting in a thinner shim inside, which would mean that the clearance increases because the shim underneath is thinner. Now Suzuki gives you an assortment of shims and they go up in increments 500th of a millimeter. So this particular shim is 1.65 of a millimeter. If we want to reduce that clearance, we can go up one size, which is 1/70 of a millimeter. Alright, so let's just have a look at that. So what we know is that with the current shim with a thickness of 1.65 millimeter, our red clearance was, as you can see here, 0.229 of a millimeter, and we need to reduce that clearance by putting thicker shim, which is 500 of a mil thicker, 170. Then we will know that 0.229 of a millimeter minus 0.05 will be equal to 0.79, which is our desired thickness. As you can see here, 0.79 is about 7,000 of an inch, which is in the middle of the specification. Alright then, so here we have another tappet, which will have the shim inside. This is from the cylinder 3 on the intake side, left hand side valve, which read 5,000 inch, which was 0.127 of a millimeter, which to me it's still okay because it's not like very tight, but I would rather prefer this to be, you know, 6 or 7. And let's have a look what's going to happen here. So here's your shim inside, and if I now remove it, what you'll see that on one side there's nothing that you can see, and on the other side the numbers are washed away. So this is what you could probably try to read this, and I think it's actually saying something like 130 or 160, one of the two. But to be 100% accurate, you would have to use what's called a micrometer. So let's just have a look what actual thickness of that shim would be. So you would just put it in here. First of all, you would clean your micrometer and your shim, but you would put it in here in a way that the shim is in the middle, and then you would lock this all up. Okay, and I can tell you now that this reads 161, so that's basically 1.6 millimeter shim. And just to make sure that my reading was correct, I'm going to confirm it with the electronic caliper. So get it all on, zero it, and let's see what we've got. There we go. So we know that our shim is 160. Okay, so we know that the thickness of that shim on the intake valve was 1.6 of millimeter, and we know that the clearance was too tight because it actually was 0.127 of a millimeter. So we want to increase the clearance, which was an exact opposite to what we did here. Now, to increase the clearance, we would have to put in the thinner shim, meaning we've got to reduce the thickness of that shim. We know that the shim was 160, so we will go with 155, which is 0.05 of a millimeter more. So we will basically add that to this number, and we will come out with point, which is going to be equal to 0.07 of an inch, like here. That's what we would want. Alright then, so here we have it. Here's another tappet. This was taken out from first cylinder exhaust side valve on the left side. So let's just get the shim out. And what we can see again is that there is no numbers there because they're washed away. So we're going to have to use the micrometer again just to measure the thickness of the shim. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, so that reads, let's have a look, that reads 1.55 of a millimeter, 1.55. And just to make sure, we're going to use the caliper as well. So get the caliper to zero. What? Come on. Okay, let's put the shim in. And here's what we've got, 1.55. Okay then, so the red clearance on that valve was 0.305 of a millimeter, which is way too loose. We want to reduce that clearance, meaning we've got to put thicker shim, which will get this tappet closer to the cam lobe. And by reducing this clearance by just 0.05 of a millimeter, so let's just take this away, 0.05, we will get 0.255 of a millimeter, which is equal to 0.010 of an inch, which for exhaust is right in the middle of the specification. So our needed shim here will be 1.6 of a millimeter, 160. Okay, so here we have another tappet. This is from the exhaust side, cylinder number 1 on the right hand side, and this is another very interesting example because the tappet doesn't have, because the shim, sorry, doesn't have any numbers on it. They're washed away. But what's going to happen is I'm going to measure it for you with the micrometer, and what you'll see, okay, so that reads, let me have a look, that's 1.58. Why is this interesting? It's because Suzuki claims all the shims go gradually up by 0.05 of a millimeter. So this would be 155 or 160. However, I got 158. So let's just confirm this with the caliper. Let's put this in the caliper. And as you can see, it actually does read 158. So what happened was, this was probably 160 shim, but because of the wear, it now got a bit thinner, so it reads 158. So the question is, what shim would I go for? And I think, just to be on the safe side, because I prefer my valves to be slightly on the loose side, especially on the exhaust, because they get very, very hot, so you don't want to burn them. I think I'm just gonna go safely with, again, just original 160 size. Alright then, so here's what we've got. 6 valves to adjust. There's going to be 4 on the exhaust side, 2 on the intake side. So here in orange, in those circles in orange, you will see the current size of the shim on those valves. And here are the new shims that I purchased. As you can see, they've got numbers nicely visible. Those are 2 160s and 1 170. So why did I only purchase 3 shims? Because the other 3 are actually here. I'm just going to reshuffle the shims. So let's have a look. So let's start from the exhaust side. First valve is the cylinder 1 exhaust valve on the left. So current shim is 155, and to adjust the clearance I need 160 shim. So here we have it. There's 160. So I'm just going to replace that, and I'll put 155 just here so I know what shim is available. There we go, next valve here. So current shim is 158, and to adjust that I once again need 160. So I'm gonna move 158 here and put 160 here. Okay, the next valve is gonna be the exhaust on cylinder 4, the left valve. So current shim 155, and what I need to adjust that is the 160. So I haven't got any more 160s from the fresh ones, but I know that this here is 160, and that needs to be changed too. So I'll simply move that 160 onto here. There we go. And then again, on the last valve on the exhaust side here, current shim is 152, and what I need to adjust that will be the 155. And let's have a look if I have 155 anywhere. And I've got 155 here because I just moved it from there, so I can simply move this away and put 155 here, and I know that this is 152. Okay, so let's go for the intake. So current shim here is 165, and to adjust that valve I'm gonna need 170 shim, and 170 is the one that I purchased. Let's just have a look. There we go, that's my 170. So I'm just going to put 170 here and move the old shim just here. And the last valve here is the current shim was 160, which I've moved there, but to adjust that I'm going to need 155. So let's have a look if we have 155 anywhere. There we go, I've got 155 here. So I'm just going to move it here. And we are done. Okay, so let's start putting it back together. Very important tip, all the parts, all those tappets have to go back to the exactly same place as they came out. Okay, so just one little tip before you start putting your shims in. So the service manual says that the shims have to be lubed both from the top and the bottom. I prefer to just put some oil inside there and then put the oil onto the tappet, and once you've got both ends lubricated, you're good to go. Okay, so we'll just put some oil in there. Alright, so just remember that the side of the numbers goes towards the top. Now the tappet was nicely lubed, so I can now cover it. There we go. Right, so here we have it. This is going to be the next tappet for exhaust valve on the right hand side on cylinder 1. Once again, let's just get some oil in there. As you can see, the numbers 160, that's going to go towards the top. Shim is in. And then I'm going to cover it with the tappet. There we go. Okay, so cylinder number 4 now on the exhaust side, left hand side valve, shim the number side towards the top. With some oil in there. Excellent. And hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm doing here. And the next one, so exhaust cylinder 4, the right hand side valve. Again, the numbers towards the top. And of course the tappet, nicely lubed. And it goes in. The intake side, cylinder number 1, right hand side valve. Again, the numbers towards the top. So this is 170 shim. Simply put it in there. You can see it sitting there. Of course, some oil in there. And simply cover it. There we go. And the last one. Okay, so the last one, intake cylinder number 3, left hand side valve. Again, numbers on the shim towards the top. I'm going to lube those necessary parts here, which is obviously the tappets. Put some of it on here as well, where the cam journals will spin. Alright, so here we have the exhaust camshaft. I'm going to start with putting the exhaust in. So all the journals and all the parts of the cams that actually have some contact with the holders, so it's here, 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 and that little ring here. All of it was nicely lubed, so you can see the red assembly lube on it. You could use oil if you don't have assembly lube, but you know, I prefer to do it with assembly lube. Now the camshaft goes in. Alright, now the intake cam goes in. Okay, so cams are in. Just about to put the cam holders back on. Just make sure that the camshafts are in exactly the same position as they came out. Now the second thing to check is also making sure that you've got your dowel pins here and here. And now simply put the cam holder on. And that will go in just like that. Right peeps, so have a look at this. You see all those cams are now getting lower and lower evenly. And here's something I've got to say, a little tip. If something feels not right, so one side will be higher, other will be lower, and for whatever reason doesn't want to come down, it's probably because, especially on those bigger holders, which is holder A and holder D, there's that little ring on the camshaft there, and that ring has to go in the groove in that holder, so probably it didn't go in. In that case, what you've got to do is grab a spanner, put it here on the side, and just try to move this camshaft one way or another to get that groove aligned with that ring on the camshaft. Alright, so all the bolts are nice and snug. I haven't torqued them up yet. I haven't put the oil pads in yet, because now we're going to have to check the timing. So to check the timing, you're going to have to put your cam chain tensioner in. Before I put a cam chain tensioner in, what I like to do is use this extension, put it in there, lean over the slide, and tap it a couple of times gently. So installation of the tensioner is easier. Inspect the gasket on this tensioner here. Make sure it's in one piece. There we go. So you can just start the bolts by hand.
A few moments later.
Now let's check if it all works. What you've got to do now is you've got to turn the crankshaft 360 degrees, or ideally even 720, and look if it's turning nicely without any binding. If it suddenly stops and you can't turn it, that means that your timing is wrong. The valve is stopping the piston and the engine can't move. This is our signal generator, and as you can see, the T mark is pointing right towards this pickup coil, and the cam lobes on the right hand side of the engine are pointing inwards. So what you've got to do now is you've got to turn it 360 degrees. There we go. And as you can see, it turns. It didn't stop me, so that means that nothing is stopping the engine. And now this is the right hand side of the motorcycle. And have a look at the front camshaft, which is obviously the exhaust camshaft. And what you've got to notice, can you see this little arrow here? See this little arrow on the camshaft? Okay, just here. That has to be flush with the surface of the engine. So that's the correctly positioned exhaust camshaft. Okay, so now we've turned the crankshaft 360 degrees. Obviously that means the cam lobes on the right hand side of the engine are now pointing outwards. And now we've got to count the links on the cam chain between that arrow here. You see there's a little arrow on the sprocket, and there's a number 2 next to it, and that arrow here. And it's got a number 3 next to it. Hopefully you can see this. So you see this is number 3 and an arrow, and that one here has number 2 and an arrow. So you've got to count those links, and hopefully it's going to be 13. So let's count it. Right, so that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That's perfect. Let's not forget about the very important step, which is torquing down all those cam holder bolts to 10 Newton meters. So I've got my torque wrench here set up to 10 Newton meters. Alright guys, so we've got everything nicely tightened up, torqued up and secured. What you've got to do now is turn the engine by hand a few times just to get rid of the oil from in between the tappets and the shim. Then recheck your valve clearance to make sure it's all good. This is what I ultimately got. So as you can see, those are inch values. Alright, so installation of valve cover. Just put a tiny amount of RTV in those points here. Remember that it only goes in one way. So this is towards the front. Alright man, so all the cover bolts are in, nice and snug. Now let's torque them down to 14 Newton meters. Alright then folks, so then put your spark plugs in. I haven't filmed it because I thought I pressed the button to record, but I didn't. But obviously you know how to put the plugs in. So put the plugs in, then put the coils in. So the coils are bolted on. Now just put the cables in. And the last step, obviously connect your coils. Now you've got your signal generators cover. Simply bolt it on. Okay man, so at that point all the difficult stuff is behind you now. All you have to do is reinstall the carbs and airbox and put the fuel tank on. So I'm not going to bother with showing that. And by the way, I've done it on this video where I installed the GSXR camshaft. Thanks for watching, till next time.